Let's bring you this development now. Standard Bank is facing increasing backlash from environmental activists who picketed outside the company's Johannesburg headquarters, demanding an end to its investment in fossil fuel projects. At the center of that demonstration is the construction of a $3.5 billion pipeline that stretches from Uganda to Tanzania. We're told that if this is built, the pipeline will carry about 1.7 billion barrels of crude pumped in western Uganda to the coast of Tanzania and international markets. Activists say that the pipeline will have a devastating consequence for local communities, wildlife, as well as climate change. Let's get a sense of the machinations at play here and bring in Tracy Davies. She's the Executive Director of Just Share. It's a non-profit organization championing the ideal of responsible investment. Tracy, thanks for your time. I also see joining us there is Kenny Fihla, Standard Bank's Chief Executive for Corporate and Investment Banking. To both our guests, thanks for your time. It's great to see you. Tracy, perhaps let me start with you by just asking that you paint the context for us around why Standard Bank specifically has a target on its back as part of your activism.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, I guess I should start by saying that it really isn't just Standard Bank that is the target of this kind of activism. It's banks all over the world. And that is because, as your viewers will know, we are in a climate crisis. And if we want to ensure that we reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we actually have to end investment in new fossil fuels pretty much immediately. So it's important to understand that when we engage with and challenge banks like Standard Bank on this, no one is suggesting that they switch off all their funding for fossil fuels tomorrow morning. This is part of a just transition to a low-carbon economy in which we are saying banks must invest far more in renewable energy and wind down their funding to fossil fuels. So the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, or EACOP, is a very, very big new oil pipeline. And that's why the likes of Standard Bank are appearing to be targeted more than others, because there's a huge focus on this pipeline at the moment. We say it shouldn't happen. It's not necessary. The International Energy Agency says we do not need these kinds of new projects, or we shouldn't have these new projects if we're going to tackle climate change. And so there's a point now where Standard Bank is in the process of making a decision about whether or not to finance this pipeline, and hence the focus on Standard Bank and that particular pipeline at the moment. And if I could just say one more thing, which is, this is really not an environmental activism issue. This is a climate issue. Climate change is a human rights issue, and it's really affecting communities across Africa in very negative ways.
Yeah. Kenny, if Standard Bank were to pull out of this, it would certainly send a strong message. Help us understand the commitment the company has to reducing its carbon footprint, both directly and indirectly through investments.
No, thank you very much for that question. I mean, we agree entirely with the objectives of what Just Share and a whole range of other activists are trying to achieve with regard to the reduction of carbon emission, as well as the target of net zero emission by 2050. And we have absolutely no disagreement with that. We have adopted a policy that seeks to guide how we should undertake our own journey towards that objective, which seeks to balance the following. Firstly, giving people in Africa access to energy and electricity. Nearly 60% of Africans still do not have access to reliable and safe electricity. Secondly, the massive issues of unemployment, with South Africa alone having unemployment levels of over 35%. And thirdly, the Human Development Index in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa is the worst compared to any other region in the world. So we need to balance all of these objectives and make sure that we move towards the goal of the reduction in carbon emission in a manner that is balanced and in a manner that does not add to the adverse conditions that people in sub-Saharan Africa are already facing. That's really the approach of Standard Bank. No disagreement whatsoever on the end goal. It's a question of how do we manage the journey such that we also take care of job creation, access to energy, as well as the improvement in the quality of lives of people.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound great, but I mean, it doesn't really address what's at the heart of the contention for our discussion today. Yes, I think everyone will agree that reduced unemployment is ideal, sustained energy supply is too. The question becomes, at what cost?
No one is arguing for irresponsible development, not at all. We have to understand that we have a serious problem of rising temperatures globally. If you look at the relative contribution of Africa to carbon emission, it's very small. So clearly Africa has to play its part. We can't say, no, we're not responsible for this problem, we're not going to bear our part. Of course we have to bear our part. But to put an undue burden to Africa when the real challenge lies in Europe, in the US, and in Asia, I think is also a bit unfair and grossly unjust. So we're simply arguing for a just transition. That's all we're arguing for. Not necessarily opposed to the goal. As I said, we support it wholeheartedly. All we're arguing for is that let's be balanced and let's do this in a responsible manner that also takes into account that ultimately people need to have access to social amenities and access to electricity.
Tracy, I guess the question becomes, are we barking up the wrong tree by trying to hold multilaterals in Africa responsible for a problem that I think is well known, actually probably started and is still perpetuated largely in the global north?
This is a hugely valid point, and of course the core of the argument about how quickly and how extensively Africa should take action to tackle climate change. But unfortunately, we have now left this problem so late that there is simply no space for us to say that some people need to act and other people don't need to act. And, you know, Africa has a really poor track record of converting fossil fuel growth and development into tackling poverty and inequality. If you look at Angola, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at what's happening in Mozambique, and if you look at South Africa itself, you know, fossil fuels are no longer the cheapest way to increase energy access. And so, you know, it's just, we don't believe that argument holds water in terms of tackling unemployment and inequality in Africa, because actually it's cheaper and easier to increase energy access across Africa using distributed renewable energy. And pipelines like the East Africa crude oil pipeline are going to be transporting oil from Uganda to the port of Tanga for export. So we're also not convinced that project is going to, you know, have any significant impact on energy poverty or inequality in East Africa. But, you know, the other issue is that these kinds of projects, you know, there are many studies, and Standard Bank has, you know, employed consultants, we know, to assess the impacts of these projects to make sure that it's being carried out responsibly. But quite frankly, these kinds of massive multi-country fossil fuel projects, the impact simply can't be mitigated. People are being displaced from their land. The natural habitat, the environments that this pipeline will flow through, the climate impacts of this pipeline. So really the strong message from activists, Standard Bank and Total, which is the developer, and many other banks all around the world that are still plowing money into fossil fuels, is stop doing that. We don't need them anymore. The cheapest way to improve energy access and alleviate poverty in Africa is massive investments in renewable energy.
Right. Kenny, there's obviously a lot of concerns around whether or not this kind of project will even lead to the desired outcome. Let's say possibly that it does. Does Standard Bank still want to be associated with a kind of project that has many people so concerned about the well-beings of the community members in which the project is actually founded? The optics don't look great.
Look, I mean, I think we are equally concerned about the damage to the environment. We are concerned about how communities are engaged, how the issue of resettlement, where people have to be moved, will be undertaken. We are concerned about whether the energy or the oil that's going to be extracted will find its way to local communities and will make an impact with regard to their own access to sort of a cheaper and reliable energy, which is why we have employed an independent sort of consultant who would be working for us at Standard Bank. And their exclusive mandate, firstly, is to review all the studies that would be undertaken, whether it's environmental impact assessment studies, or whether it's the way communities are engaged, the plans that have been put in place to deal with compensation as well as the relocation of people, and whether they are also given social amenities wherever they'll be resettled to also assess issues of human rights, child labor, and all of those issues. And upon us receiving satisfactory answers against all of those, we will then consider whether we want to fund or not. At this stage, we are not really at a decision where we have to make a call about whether we put money into the project. All that we're arguing for is give us a chance to assess this in an objective and a balanced manner and to go through the process as we would with any other initiative, that it will be wrong to have a blanket decision that says no to this kind of development, irrespective of whether the impact will be positive or not. I think we have to go through a due process, make sure that we make informed decisions, that we're guided by science, and that we take input from an independent consultant who's an expert, a specialist in this field, who would also give us a sense as to whether all the right boxes are ticked in a very, very fundamental and substantive way.
Yeah.
And we support, the growth and the funding of renewable energy. If anything, we are hungry for those kind of projects. And I think Tracy makes a very important point about the fact that development in Africa has unfortunately not benefited fully Africans and local communities. And that is true also for fossil fuels. And that means then that we also need to put as much blame and as much pressure on governments to act in a responsible kind of manner. If governments, for example, were to accelerate the issuing of renewable licenses, we'll be more than happy to support and participate in that process. If they were to insist on the sort of development of new sort of power stations in a manner that is environmentally sustainable and so on, we'll be gladly willing to participate and support all of those developments. Unfortunately, we can only support what is available in the market. And with our governments not moving fast enough from a policy point of view, from issuing of renewable tenders and opening up of our generation, they are unfortunately prolonging this problem and exacerbating the dilemma that we have to deal with on a daily basis.
Got you, Kenny. Got you. Your sentiments are well captured. And, one can only hope. I mean, it's quite obvious. This is a multi-stakeholder issue. And not only a Standard Bank will be responsible for whatever happens here. And one can certainly hope that the conversation can be widened to include all stakeholders to push in the direction that I feel we all actually want to go ultimately. For now, let me thank you both for your time. Tracy Davies is with Just Share. It's a non-government organization looking at environmental issues. She's the executive director there. Kenny Fihla, Standard Bank's chief executive for corporate and investment banking. To both of you, once again, thanks very much indeed.